Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles. The series of books and videos on American history is seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Grover Cleveland, and the focus is Reform Governor. The year is 1882, and the veto mayor of Buffalo is starting to get attention, not just in the city, but across the state for his aggressive reforms. In particular, that episode we talked about in our prior episode about the street cleaning contract that he put the kibosh on as mayor. He stood up against the aldermen, got the city a much better deal for the taxpayer. These are the kinds of things pushing back on the old world, old guard corruption was starting to get Cleveland noticed outside of Buffalo, including from Edgar Apgar, who was an up-and-comer in the Democratic Party in the state. He was one of those who was already setting his eyes on Cleveland as a candidate for governor of New York. Now, Cleveland was interested in this. He said, look, I'm not going to pursue the position. If it's offered me, I will accept the nomination. But here's the deal. I'm not making any pledges. In fact, Apgar, I am not even going to meet with any of the leaders in the Democratic Party in the state because that might give the appearance that I'm making some kind of deals. If you want me, fine, but you got to take me as I come. And for this, Apgar was actually pretty thrilled. Well, at the Democratic Convention, there were certainly others in the mix. Cleveland was not popular with the anti-reformers, the old-style political machines like the ones at Tammany Hall and their boss, John Kelly. They thought anybody except a reformer like Cleveland, so there was certainly opposition. Cleveland himself was not at this convention, and it wasn't for political reasons, it was for personal reasons. His mother was ailing, and so he went off to Holland Patton, New York, the family home. He spent some time with her, but Anne Cleveland would not survive, and now both of his parents would be gone. But his political prospects were certainly on the rise. Apgar took the stage to give the second nominating speech for Cleveland at the Democratic Convention. It was a forceful address, all in favor of reform. If you want reform, you want a Grover Cleveland. That was the message from Edgar Apgar. Well, the reformers won out. In fact, it took only 3 ballots for Cleveland to get the nomination from the Democrats for the governorship. He accepted, and he was espousing his conservative principles in his acceptance letter. The limited role of state government is what he emphasized. He said, I am unalterably opposed to the interference by the legislature with the government of municipalities. The doctrine of home rule, as I understand it, lies at the foundation of Republican institutions and cannot be too strongly insisted upon, those conservative principles from Grover Cleveland. The Republicans that would go up against Cleveland, well, they had some conflict of themselves. The incumbent governor was Alonzo Cornell, but he had gotten crosswise with the political boss on the Republican side, Roscoe Conkling. And for that, Cornell was not renominated. In his place was the current Treasury Secretary of the United States, Charles Folger, but the party had actually really been fractured over all of this, which was good news for Grover Cleveland. He won the state in a rout by nearly 200,000 votes. His margin, he won 58.5% of the popular vote. That was the largest margin in state history in a governor's race, and it was actually a clean sweep for the Democrats. They won all the state offices, and they actually won the state assembly. They got a majority there as well. So there was a big momentum for Grover Cleveland as he was off to Albany to take on the governorship. Now, he was not going to change. He was the same man, the same earnest hard worker, hands-on, serious reformer. No detail was too small for his attention, no compromise on the topics of right and wrong. He was going to pick his side and he was going to stick with it. These were the principles that had worked well for him up till this point. He saw no reason to change. Did he have much help coming with him to Albany? Not really. His sister, Mary Hoyt, agreed to serve as his housekeeper, so she moved in, and he picked as his personal secretary Daniel Lamont. Lamont had been the editor of the Albany Argus. The fact is, they were like-minded politically, like-minded in their work ethic. In fact, Grover Cleveland said of Lamont, he is a wonderful man. I never saw his like. He has no friends to gratify or reward, no enemies to punish. In fact, Daniel Lamont would be at Grover Cleveland's side throughout the rest of his political career. Well, the reformers were actually going to be happy with Cleveland, but the anti-reformers were not right out of the gate in the topic of civil service reform, which was starting to gain some traction nationally, including here in the state of New York, and Grover Cleveland was committed to it. What did this mean? Just because he was coming in as a Democratic administration, those Republicans who had put their people into state offices and part of the bureaucracy, Grover Cleveland was not going to summarily dismiss him. This idea of the spoils of victory and the patronage that went with it, that was anathema to Grover Cleveland. He thought it was unfair, it wasn't good use of taxpayer dollars, sometimes putting incompetence into these jobs. He was not going to make wholesale changes and toss the Republicans out, and for this, he made some enemies. Not only Tammany Hall, but a lot of his friends in Buffalo. His Democratic supporters thought that they were going to be up for jobs. Not going to happen in front of the care of Governor Grover Cleveland. Well, the veto mayor certainly also became the veto governor. He scrutinized every piece of legislation that crossed his desk, and if he disagreed on policy or even thought it was poorly worded or poorly crafted, he was happy to bring out his veto pen and send it back to the legislature. First year alone, 44 vetoes coming from the pen of Grover Cleveland. He saw himself as the protector of the public purse. And things that were like local funded, things that should have been local funded, he was not going to have state funds being used. One example, good cause from his old hometown of Fayetteville. They wanted a new fire engine and the state was going to pay for it. And he said no. That should be bought with local funds, not bought with state funds. And his conscience would not actually make any sacrifices to political expediency. Give you an example. There was the 5-cent bill. Now, this was a very popular bill that crossed his desk that would have lowered the cost for transit on the elevated trains in New York City to 5 cents for every fare, no matter what time of day, 7 days a week. This would bring it down to 5 cents across the board, and Grover Cleveland vetoed it. It wasn't that he was fond of the financier, Jay Gould, who had actually owned the contract that had put up the capital in advance of building these elevated trains. He didn't care much for Gould, and he actually thought it was fine to actually help out the poorer people to get these lower rates, but he thought it was bad business for the state to unilaterally abrogate a contract. He thought that was unfair. Gould and his supporters had put out that capital to build those elevated trains what the city needed, and he expected a certain return on that investment, and Grover Cleveland thought it was imperative to honor that. And in his veto message, he said, "It seems to me that to arbitrarily reduce these fares at this time and under existing circumstances involves a breach of faith on the part of the state and a betrayal of confidence which the state has invited. It is manifestly important that invested capital should be protected." Now, he realized the 5-cent bill was really popular, and he thought when he left that office that night that he said, "By tomorrow at this time, I shall be the most unpopular man in the state of New York." But the fact is, the opposite occurred. People actually embraced the reform, the pushback, the principle that Governor Cleveland was bringing to this particular veto. And more than that, his veto message actually changed some minds, which almost never happens in a political discourse. But one of those we know changed his mind was a young assemblyman in the state government by the name of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was just getting started in politics, and he was a reformer like Cleveland, although he was a Republican, and while they would find some common cause in reform efforts, they would also be on the opposite side of things over the next couple of decades. But on this topic, the veto from Cleveland actually convinced Roosevelt that Cleveland was right. He changed his mind and voted to sustain that veto. According to Theodore Roosevelt, that I believe the veto was proper, and that those who felt as I did supported that veto. For although it was entirely right that the fare should be reduced to 5 cents, which was soon afterward done, the method was unwise and would have set a mischievous precedent. So he even made a believer on this particular point of Theodore Roosevelt. Now, in some instances, Cleveland's instincts kind of failed him. This was the case of Senator Thomas Grady in the state of New York Senate. He was an anti-reformer against almost everything that Cleveland put forward, so he was really kind of the political enemy there in the state legislature, and Cleveland wanted him out. But he was a Tammany man. So Cleveland took the bold step to write his political rival, the boss at Tammany Hall, John Kelly, a letter saying, "Look, find somebody else to nominate in the next go-around. Get rid of this Grady guy. He is not helping the public. He's not doing right. Let's go find somebody else." Well, this was naivete on the part of Grover Cleveland, trying to do the right thing, but John Kelly simply used this letter at the right time against Governor Cleveland. Right before the election, he pulled it out and said, look, this is this governor trying to tell us who we can nominate for this position. He can't get away with that. And in fact, it was not a good midterm election for Cleveland. The Democrats lost a bunch of seats. Some of the reformers lost as well. So this was very much a back and forth, a tension on whether or not the reformers would prevail or not. But it was not going to change anything in terms of Grover Cleveland. He was going to stay the course, and he was going to stay the course not only politically, ideologically, but also in his work habits. He was not going to slow down, even though the physical nature of his tiresome effort was really starting to take its toll. He rarely exercised. The only exercise he basically got was going back and forth from the Capitol to the governor's mansion, which he did seems like several times a day. No matter how late he worked at night, he was back at the office 9 o'clock the next morning no matter what, and people were noticing the toll this was beginning to take. According to one reporter, the eyes of the large man look glassy. His skin hangs on his cheeks in thick, unhealthy-looking folds. The colt buttoned around his large chest and abdomen looks ready to burst with the confined fat. Plainly, he is a man who is not taking enough exercise. He remains within doors constantly, eats and works and works and eats. Such work is killing work. But that's all he knew how to do. It was him and Lamont, day in, day out, every detail. That's the way he did the job. So there was opposition to the reform that the governor was putting forward, but didn't matter to him. Full speed ahead as far as he was concerned. And there were proponents, not just in the state of New York. Nationally, he was starting to get a national following, especially for his opposition at Tammany Hall. The country was starting to pay attention with another election, a national election, right around the corner. That, of course, is a story for another day. That is Grover Cleveland and Reformed Governor from the life of Grover Cleveland. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.